In other mediums such as art, architecture, design, and more recently a lifestyle, minimalism is somewhat easy to describe, or at least to visualize, but when it comes to film, it's less simple. Minimalism originated as an art movement which was developed in a post-World War II America, comprising of artists such as Stella, Agnes Martin, and Donald Judd. It was focused around the idea that art should have its own reality, and not be an imitation of some other thing. Stella famously said, "What you see is what you see," when describing his own art.
I like the idea, thinking about flatness and depth, that these would be very hard paintings to penetrate. All of the action would be on the surface.
Some may relate minimalism to a visual aesthetic of neatness, as this is often what can be seen through a minimalist lifestyle, which, at base level, can be described as focusing mostly on necessity. Due to this, images such as this come to mind when discussing minimalism. This is why some people could assume that Wes Anderson's rigorously simplified shot compositions can cause his films to be classified as minimalist films. However, this is far from reality. In its simplest terms, a minimalist film must present a narrative as realistically as possible by eliminating cinematic techniques that draw attention to themselves or unnecessarily guide the viewer. Rather than minimalist, Anderson's films are strongly stylized and are inspired more perhaps by minimalist design. His use of symmetry and long panning shots definitely draw attention to themselves. There are a number of elements that could factor into allowing a film to be described as minimalist. For instance, visual minimalism in film refers to the composition and set design. Basically, for a film to be visually minimalist, the director must completely simplify all that is seen in a frame. This could be taking out any distracting or stylized elements in the background such as artwork, dressing the character in a solid colour, or in general just focusing only on what matters in the shot. Additionally, visual minimalism could also be in relation to the cinematography and editing, in which long shots, little editing and simple setups might be used. An example of this would be Hitchcock's 1948 classic, Rope. In Rope, Hitchcock only uses 10 cuts, all of which are hidden, almost unnoticeable while watching the film. This puts the reliance not on the cinematography, but on the actors, minimising the role of the camera in the film. It also forces the film to take place in real time, which is also a characteristic of minimalist cinema, as it eliminates the complexity caused by temporal changes in the film. When it comes to movies with minimal sound design, we can mention all the silent films of the early 20s. However, it's more useful to look at films where minimalist sound design is used deliberately. A film that we can look to is 2001: A Space Odyssey. In the film, Kubrik uses limited dialogue and muted background sounds. Although it's very unlikely that Kubrik intended to give the film minimalist qualities, his aim to replicate the vacuum of space gives the film a minimal feel, as it draws attention away from the sound design. However, we probably wouldn't call it a minimalist film, as it contains lots of non-diegetic music. The content itself is far from minimalist. The plot and story certainly aren't minimal, and the film is full of metaphors. It's also worth touching upon films which use absolutely no music, such as Hitchcock's The Birds, or films with no dialogue, such as The Thief. The Thief relies predominantly on direction and acting, but doesn't intend to replicate the silent films of the 20s. This lack of dialogue increases tension in the film noir flick. Plot and story both are also elements which can be minimalist in filmmaking. However, it's important here to make the distinction between the plot and the story. The story is what happens in the film, whereas the plot is the parts of the story that are actually shown to the audience. Certain parts of the story are left in or out of the plot to have a certain effect. A minimalist story would be one which is simple and free of any really complex ideas. It will also likely use very few characters, only those which are 100% necessary in portraying the simple storyline. An example of a film with a minimalist storyline could be Castaway, a film which follows only Tom Hanks as he tries to survive on a desert island. This is due to its minimal cast and setting. Another example would be The Breakfast Club. A minimalist plot, on the other hand, will simplify how the story is portrayed to the audience. It might take place in real time, as Rope did, or show only what is completely necessary to help forward the story. It would do this by leaving out unnecessary plot points that don't help tell the story. For instance, if there's a scene in the film in which a bank robber robs a bank, a minimalist plot might show the bank robber standing outside the bank wearing a bandana, then in the next shot show the bank robber sitting in a cell at the police station, rather than showing the failed robbery itself, which is not relevant to the overarching story. When it comes to minimalist acting, we could look to the films of Yorgos Lanthimos.
Would you like to dance?
In his films, Lanthimos tends to use the interactions between characters as purely transactional, not necessarily as a way to develop characters or show intimate emotions, but as a way to help progress the story. This is why the acting in his films can feel quite robotic.
I probably do have a little more hair than you do because I'm older than you. But soon you'll have more hair too.
However, it could be argued that this is predominantly stylized to contribute to the feeling that his films are created by an auteur. For a film to be truly minimalist, which is rather uncommon to say the least, it ideally must contain minimalist elements across the board, not just some. A minimalist film is one that is stripped down to its bare essentials, left with only what is needed to portray the story that the director wishes. One director who I can truly say makes minimalist films is Abbas Kiarostami. His most minimalist is probably Shirin. The 2008 film focuses on around 100 Iranian women in a cinema watching an adaptation of the Iranian tale Shirin. All that the film contains is close-up shots of these women's faces as they watch the film, the audio of which we can hear in the background. The film is stripped down to its bare essentials, the actors and the viewer. The audience is forced to interact intimately with the characters. There's no complex cinematography, acting, plot, or story, and all we hear is what the characters hear. It's filmmaking at its most minimal. However, films such as Shirin aren't at all common, let alone have a wide appeal when it comes to the world of film. This is why, in my opinion, it's difficult at times to see minimalism as a genre of film. Instead, I believe minimalism should be seen as a technique that can be used across multiple genres and aspects of filmmaking. Minimalism in film is not categorical as it is in other mediums. It's a technique that is likely used within elements of film to get across a certain theme or to create a particular tone, and is less used for the sake of creating an entirely minimalist or simplistic entity. A film will much more likely have minimalist cinematography, but a complex story, or a minimalist story with complex acting, than be a minimalist film in itself.